of the Sustaining Global Connections in African Heritage series here at the Program of African Studies at Northwestern University. This series is being conceived by the Program of African Studies in conjunction with Kathleen Bickford-Berzuk, the Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at Northwestern University's Block Museum of Art, and Amanda Logan, Professor of Archaeology, Anthropology, and the Director of Graduate Studies at Northwestern's Department of Anthropology. This conversation and series of conversations has risen out of the very successful exhibition held here and curated by Kathleen, The Caravans of Gold, which is currently, I think, in Washington, D.C. at the moment, and may not be open thanks to COVID, but will be available nonetheless. It's been a very successful event, a very successful exhibition, perhaps one of the most interesting to come out of West Africa, at least, in other parts of Africa, Northern Africa, in the last few years in terms of its breadth of connections and the amazing ways in which all of the African institutions that participated were so generous in the programming of that. My name is Chris Abani, and I'm the director of the Program of African Studies here at Northwestern University. As is the way in all African traditions, we would like to begin with gratitude. Many thanks to the global ancestral patterns that have led us here. And thank you to all our partners, the Buffett Institute for Global Studies, for their support of this program in the form of a seed grant. Many thanks to the Block Museum here at Northwestern and to the Program of African Studies here at Northwestern and its wonderful staff. We would like to acknowledge that Northwestern University sits on the original homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi and Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and the Ho-Chunk nations. And many thanks to all our global partners in Nigeria, Dr. Babatunde, the father has returned, Babalola, archaeologist and postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge University. Mrs. Edith Ikunke has now become, I have adopted her as my auntie, the retired director of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. It is really wonderful to have you here. At this point, I have to hand you over to the very, very amazing and capable hands of Kathleen and Amanda. And what an amazing chance this is. And thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. God bless you, Chris, for Pidgin English.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the Program of African Studies for all of the excellent support they provided Kathleen and I in developing this program. We wanted to welcome listeners to the first of a series of virtual programs we call Sustaining Global Connections in African Heritage. The idea for this series emerged from the complex reality that we now find ourselves living in, as much of the globe is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really radically altered our personal and professional lives. At the same time, the pandemic is also urging us to explore and collaborate in non-traditional ways, to check in with one another wherever we are in the world. Our program focuses on conversations with cultural heritage professionals and archaeologists in Nigeria, Mali, and Morocco. Across these different contexts, we will explore how the pandemic has impacted archaeological and museums work, from closing excavations and exhibitions in the short term to undermining the financial feasibility of our work in the longer term. Woven through these pandemic concerns are larger conversations about the inequalities that thread through the cultural heritage sector, where issues of repatriation are now reaching their crescendo as the Black Lives Matter movement demands a more equitable future. We hope to explore these global issues as well as how they intersect with local and national politics with the hopes of building more resilient global partnerships. Our 2021 series, Looking Ahead with Caravans of Gold Partners, follows up on the award-winning exhibition, Caravans of Gold, Fragments in Time, Art, Culture, and Exchange Across Medieval Saharan Africa. Opened in 2019, the exhibit was curated by Dr. Kathleen Bickford-Berzuk, Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs at Northwestern University's Block Museum. We seek to follow up on the important international partnerships with institutions and archaeologists that were fundamental to its success as a jumping off point of sorts to building more sustainable collaborations. I'm Dr. Amanda Logan, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Northwestern University and Specialist in West African Archaeology, and I'll be moderating today's discussion in collaboration with Kathleen, to whom I now turn to introduce today's esteemed guests.
Thanks, Amanda. I want to join my colleagues, Amanda and Chris, in expressing my thanks and my gratitude to everybody who's helped us to get this program organized, and especially to Dr. Babalola and Mrs. Akunke, who are here with us today. Today's African Heritage and Dialogue conversation will focus on the intersection of the museum sector and archaeology in Nigeria. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our guests for this conversation. Mrs. Edith Akunke is the retired Director of Museums for the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments, or the NCMM. And Dr. Adedeme Babatunde Babalola is the Smuts Research Fellow in African Studies at the University of Cambridge and an archaeologist working at sites in Nigeria, including Ile-Ife. The exhibition Caravans of Gold, as you've heard, is providing an impetus for this series of conversations. And the exhibition provides a wide view of the impact of exchange and circulation from the perspective of the Sahara, including by following the Niger River from its northernmost point as it passes through the Sahara and downward to the Bight of Benin in present-day Nigeria. The exhibition presents artworks and archaeological fragments that help us to draw lines of connection between the wealthy city-states of, for instance, Ikpo Ukwu, Ife, and Derby Takushe, that's included in the exhibition and is also available for viewing on the exhibition's website. Together, Mrs. Akunke and Dr. Babalola represent an important tenet of the curatorial methodology that we used in Caravans of Gold, the collaboration across areas of expertise that's essential for understanding complex histories and making them visible to visitors to museums. We're thrilled to have this opportunity to catch up with Mrs. Akunke and Dr. Babalola today. So, Mrs. Akunke, let's start with you. You recently retired after a more than 20-year career with the NCMM. Can you tell us how you began your career in cultural history and what your various roles at the NCMM were throughout that career?
Well, I want to say that the cultural sector in Nigeria is not one that people like to go into. And actually, I just came into that sector by chance. In the year 1986, we were looking for jobs. And that year we had this austerity measure in Nigeria. And a sister of mine came and said, look, there's a job for you in the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. I said, what is that? That's the question I asked her. And she said, just go and try. I had never been to a museum before, joining the services of National Commission for Museums and Monuments. I went to the then late Professor Ekweyo. He was the head of NCMM at that time. And he just said, go to your uncle, get a letter, and then come and work with me. I just went, they gave me, because we were looking for a job, any job could do at that time. So I got the letter, they interviewed me and then gave me the job. But as time passed, actually I wanted to leave the museum services. I thought they were about cultural objects. And in Nigeria, cultural objects are viewed as what we call in quote, juju. And I wasn't comfortable with it. But after some time, the museum grew on me. I started having affiliation to cultural things cultural. I found out that we were not educated in quote when it comes to cultural heritage. And that's how I started up in the museum and I grew. Actually, the then late Professor Eyo took me as a PRO, public relation officer for the museum. But after that, I translated being a curator. From curatorial vision, I rose from curator, senior curator, up to the director of museums. And it's a worthwhile experience. I can remember that some people kept on asking me, where are you working? Because of what my experiences, my contacts in the cultural sector, people started, it became an attraction to many people to come into this sector. And I want to say that working in the cultural sector has been a very fulfilled one. I was once the acting director of museums before director of museums. I mandate the international decks, international exhibitions, and then so many other areas. Not only that, I even ventured into the educational services area in Calabar, and I headed the Lagos Museum, National Museum Lagos at one time, and it culminated into being the director of museums, which I retired meritoriously in 2020, October 2020. Thank you.
Wow, it seems like you've done almost every role possible in the NCMM system. It's really you've had such a brilliant and meaningful career, and I know I'm really grateful to all the ways that you've been supportive of my connections with the Nigerian cultural heritage sector. So thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Babalola, what path did you take in becoming an archaeologist? And I'm curious to know too, if you felt a similar, I don't know, surprise in your path towards cultural heritage, as Mrs. Akunke has expressed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caitlin, and also thank you, Amanda, for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And I think although there is decades of years, in between myself and Mrs. Ekuke, but I think there is something that is common to both of us, which is the surprise, and also kind of finding ourselves in a cultural heritage, practice by, let's say by, not really by choice, by kind of, accident, so to speak. So for me, in high school, my best subject was accounting, and then it was to become an accountant. I mean, in part because that was my dad's favorite choice of career for every one of us, and I was studying hard to become an accountant. However, when it's, become the time to apply to the university, I found myself in archaeology, which I never expected, and I didn't actually know what it actually was, really. So I spent my entire first semester in archaeology trying to figure out what I've actually got myself into, because it was something really unexpected and not in any way connected with, the vision I actually had for my life and for myself. So it was a little bit kind of struggle for my my first semester in archaeology, because I couldn't really, figure out where I really belonged. So, and I remember my first year, I had to combine a lot of classes, in sociology, with the mind that I will perhaps change to sociology. So, so I continued that mystery part in archaeology until when I was in, my junior year. And then we had, because the way archaeology is structured in Ibadan, University of Ibadan is so spectacular, and I think I like it in the sense that it allows the archaeology students to go through fieldwork experience from their sophomore year throughout their year in the university. So that means as a graduate of archaeology from Nigeria, you have 3 good years of field work experience. So my first experience was not too spectacular, so I was still thinking of I'm going to change. But my junior year experience in fieldwork was actually brought me face to face with the realities of archaeology. For me at that time, being part of a fieldwork, engaging with the materials, being part of uncovering of some archaeological features, and then being able to discuss with people in the village where we had that fieldwork, that was really Jai, somewhere in outskirts of Ibadan. So really kind of got me interested in archaeology, like, wow, this is real. This is something I can relate with. I excavated this material myself, and I can actually think about what people thought about them in the past. And I can, during that engagement with the material, I can unveil how people were thinking in the past and how people, what people used, how people related with the environment in the past really got me interested in archaeology. And then, of course, after I finished my undergrad, I thought perhaps I had interest, but it's going to end there. I'm not going to go further. However, I continue to be part of what I consider to be more focused, serious archaeological research, assisting some of my professors at that time in field work. I worked at, I remember I worked in the Igbo area, the northern part of Nigeria, working with Professor Usman Aribidesi from Arizona State University around the Igbo area. I also assisted a couple of senior colleagues in ACA. Then I also worked at, other places. While I was doing my break from undergrad and waiting for what I will do for my master's. So I was part of this different, archaeological research projects that I consider to be very real, and also partook in a late Stone Age, research somewhere around the outskirts of Ile-Ife with a professor of mine there was studying in Germany for his PhD. So all these experiences now culminated into, my interest in archaeology and actually got me, going in archaeology. And that was how I tended to I decided finally to stay in archaeology. And of course, I applied to Rice University, and I was fortunate enough to have the, the offer to work with Susan McIntosh for my PhD. And that was, how I find myself in archaeology and in cultural studies today.
Thanks, thanks, Tunde. Mrs. Akunke, the National Commission for Museums and Monuments has a new Director General, Dr. Abba Tijani, and he comes from a background in museums and in anthropology. His previous position was as the chair of the art department and deputy director of archives and records at the University of Maiduguri. Can you share with us the main agenda items for the commission under the new DG's leadership?
I want to say that we've not had a substantive DG for about 2 years, and then he came on board. And when somebody comes on board, he wants to make an impact. And I think he's ready to make an impact in the museum. And he's taking it maybe step by step. He is coming from the academia, and the way the civil service works is quite different from the university setting. But I know that he's focused. He wants to revamp totally the museum services in Nigeria. And that needs money. He's gone out sourcing for money for this, and also trying to enter into partnership. When you talk of budgeting in Nigeria, you find out that this cultural sector is way, way down. They think of health, think of the media, because that covers them. They think of education, but culture per se is something that is right behind. So for you to make anything out of this cultural sector, you need other partnerships aside from government budgeting. And you know that these days is the government budget, or the finances from the government, is dwindling every day, every year. And then with the issue of COVID, the COVID pandemic, it has further dwindled again. So what he is doing is looking out for partnerships with private companies, with individuals that, want to have something to do with the cultural sector overseas as well as internally, to see how we could revamp our old exhibition, moribund exhibitions. Some of them have been there for about 30 years, some of these permanent exhibitions. So we want to do a new exhibition with a new perspective, because we have so much objects in our museum. Kathleen, you've entered our stores. If we want to exhibit those objects for the next 5-6 years, we'll have objects to exhibit, different types. So he's looking at the exhibitions, he's looking at rehabilitating the various buildings, he's looking at also training the staff. It's one of the things he's looking at, bringing the staff up to date with the current realities in the museum services. And then doing expansion work also. There are areas we need to expand in the museum. We have so many, like if you talk of departments under heritage and sites, we have so many sites as well as monuments outside Nigeria. There's need to man those things. Why I'm saying there's need to man those things is because, you know, most of our people are not conversant with what, for them, it doesn't, why are you keeping all these things? The influence of Christianity, the influence of Islam also, you know, has dwindled the interest of the people, you know, when it comes to cultural artifacts. But he's trying to look at that area also, reaching out to the community, reaching out to our communities, reaching out to the educational centers, sectors, reaching out to even our legislators to educate them about the need to preserve our patrimony, the need to preserve our cultural heritage. So these are some of the things, and you know that he has to prioritize. It mustn't be everything at the rest, depending on the financial capability of the museum at this time. So first of all, I think what he's doing is to revamp the existing exhibition and then to renovate also the structures on ground. Thank you.
So Dr. Babalola, we'd like to continue the same question to you as particularly what research projects you're currently working on. We know you are based in Cambridge at the moment, but I saw several points of intersection with what Mrs. Okunke has just said in the sort of need to reach the community with cultural heritage work. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. I think, first of all, before I talk specifically about the project I'm working on, I think in all of my projects, community engagement has been a priority because of, number one, of course, ethically speaking is important, and also because of the area we are working at, you know, in Nigeria and among the people we're working where there is little understanding of, you know, connection with the past, understanding of the archaeological objects, you know. So we think working with the people, with the community is very, very important, and is being, you know, at the center of my research, you know, anywhere I work in Nigeria. So that has always been, you know, guiding my research methods and even my research design and stuff, which I think is very, very important for Nigeria, especially at this time whereby, you know, like Ms. Ekuki mentioned, Christianity and Islam, you know, is very much, you know, popular, and then people don't really want to connect with anything that has to do, you know, with the archaeological objects and the past in general. So in light of that, presently I'm continuing with my project on the glass making in classical Ile-Ife, you know, 9th, 10th, 11th century, thereabout the 15th century. So that has been ongoing. I actually started the project for my dissertation, you know, and then since after I finished my PhD, I've discovered that there is actually a lot more for us to understand about this, the glassmaking technology, not only in Ife, but in the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa, because before now, we don't really have an idea that, you know, sub-Saharan African were actually locally making glass, you know, in 11th century, you know, up to now. So this, I consider this to be a very, so to speak, new subfield, you know, in terms of understanding the archaeology of glass in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think there is need to spend some more time looking at different aspects of the technology, the production, acquisition of raw material, processing of the raw material, production of the other objects and apparatus that they use, and tools as well that they use in the production, and the transition from glass making, which is the process of gathering of the raw material, to glass working, whereby they transform the molten glass into several objects, different objects. But in Ife, we know that glass bead, was perhaps one of the major objects that was being made at that time. So I think there's still time for me, there's still need for me to spend some more time on this glass making project. So I'm still very much working on the glass technology. However, there are several aspects of the technology that I'm working on now. So in terms of looking at Ife as an ancient urban complex, I'm beginning to look at the role that biotechnology actually played, in the formation of Ife urbanism and social complexity. So not only glass making, there is evidence, of course, in form of those copper alloy objects. So we believe that copper casting was going on somewhere, but we are yet to kind of pinpoint on the location. So one of the things I'm doing now is to try to carry out a survey, within Ife and also outside, to see if we'll be able to situate, industrial area within the larger, Ife urban complex, and to see the role that this technological aspect, craft specialization actually played, in the emergence of social complexity in Ife. And also, I'm also working on what I call digital documentation of glass bead making use and symbolism among the Ife people. So that is actually part of the Endangered Material Knowledge Program, of the British Museum. So the project is being funded by, British Museum Endangered Material Knowledge Program. So the idea is to digitally document the production process of glass bead making in Ile-Ife, owing to the fact that this glass bead, the knowledge of glass bead making is highly endangered in Ife, because not even so many, nobody actually does it today, but we still have quite a few people who were connected with the production, or who saw their grandparents or their parents making glass beads many years back. So we try to locate these people and have them demonstrate to us how to make glass bead, and then we digitally document the process of production, interview a lot of people, from priests who use different color of glass beads as part of the paraphernalia of their ritual office, to talk to them, to see the meaning, the changing meaning, and the symbolism of glass beads and the color, in relation to the deity and the office that they actually also that they actually occupy. So I'm also currently doing that project to document all these that I've mentioned, so that they are available to the public. We're going to be stored in the public domain online, with the British Museum, where it's going to be. This is not a documentary, it's a documentation of this process, so that people can have access to it. And also, very quickly, I'm also working on another project in Igbo-Ukwu, which we just started a couple of months ago. Perhaps there'll be time for me to talk more about that. So we're trying to revisit Igbo-Ukwu and see what new we can get and what new we can contribute to what Constantia did 60 years ago. Thank you. I think I will stop there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Babalola. It's so wonderful to hear about your work with glass, which has really been paradigm shifting, not only in archaeology, I think, but across anyone who's studying the past in West Africa. And I especially enjoy, hearing about how you're connecting this to the present through work with glass makers and sort of making this information open and access and available. Hopefully we can continue on that line a little bit more in a minute. So I want to shift now to ask you both to reflect on how the pandemic has impacted your work. Mrs. Okunke, if we could ask first how the NCMM has managed with the pandemic. Have museums been closed? Is work continuing? What is sort of your take on how the pandemic has impacted the museum sector in Nigeria?
Thank you, Amanda. Before I answer that question, I want to ask Dr. Babalola whether he's working in conjunction with the NCMM.
Thank you, Ma. Yes, I mean, that is the straight answer, to your question. Yes, because since I started my work in 2009, I've been working in partnership and collaboration with the museum's staff, in Ife. And I remember I visited Abuja when Dr. Ambulu was State Director of Research, 2009, I think thereabout, to discuss my project with him. Then it was still very vague, in my mind, but at least I was in Abuja and I discussed, the project with him, and also for me to get a permit at that time, to excavate. But I mean, in the last many years that I've been working in partnership with the staff from the Ife Museum, and they've been really wonderfully well, and they've been part of my project from the outset. Thank you.
I want to apologize for that interjection because we are the supervisory organ of cultural heritage. That's why I'm asking that question. When you talk of the pandemic, in 2020, it really affected museum services. And what we did at that time was to ask curators. At one time, most people were not going to work, and we don't have the type of communication gadgets you people have. So to work online, it's difficult. But what we did was to ask the curators to collect, information about the pandemic. Because what we are trying to do is that we are looking at the future. This pandemic will come and go. What do we have to say about it? So we ask most of the curators to go to the field, collect as many information as they can. And then, it's not, we know pandemic, this time pandemic, but in the past also we had pandemics that we had in our history, things that killed people en masse and everything. So it's something you can do comparison with. And at that particular time, people were not coming to the museum, and these people had to go to the field to get equipment, get information about the COVID. And then, as much as possible, we ask them to try and educate as many that they come in contact. The few people coming into the museum, you educate them about the COVID pandemic. And I want to say that after, opening up of the economy, what we did is that we had to put in place things to make it easy for visits. People started coming back, schools started coming, but it was a bit difficult because you need to have limited number of people coming into the galleries. You have washing of the hands using of disinfectant and all those things. And then you have to disinfect the galleries at intervals. So it was a Herculean task. But in spite of that, we're able to contain it. And in Nigeria, like I said, when you talk of culture, most people, they don't care about culture. Someone will ask you, I'll speak in pidgin English. He says, nah, culture we go eat. That's what can culture feed us? Because they were particular about feeding. In Africa, the question of feeding, it's there. And then, so we had fewer visitors coming to the museum. We had, and also staff, most members of staff were home just only the top management of staff were allowed to come to the museum. So it was, what will I say, not a very good time for the museum. But with this second wave, it's not as bad as the first wave, I should say, in quote. People still go about their businesses and people still visit the museum. Even when we have cultural workshop, cultural things, we make sure we put, things in place, to meet up with the COVID provisions. So I would say that we are working, but at half capacity. We are not working fully as before, because you need to take into cognizance the issue of the COVID. So for now, it has been a bit difficult. And like I said, we don't have communication gadget that we could easily communicate with the outstations. But what we do, we send circulars, we send working tools, and then they make use of that for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that answer, and also to the wider reference towards feeding and feeding with culture. And as an archaeologist who works on food, it's definitely an interest of mine, but also tacks back to the wider issue of this is a larger issue than museums or in heritage work. There's a lot of very practical issues in the pandemic that are affecting everybody. Dr. Babalola, I wonder if we could turn to you now and ask the same kind of questions for archaeology. How has analysis been impacted? How has this conversation maybe playing out in both the environments you're closely involved in both the UK and in Nigeria? And I ask this, specifically because in North America, a lot of us archaeologists are sort of having discussions as to whether or not it's ethical to return to do field work for those of us who work abroad during the pandemic. And I wonder how this conversation has worked out in the different contexts in which you're closely involved.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. I think before I respond to that question specifically, let me also, I would like to also add to, my initial response to Mrs. Ekuke's question about involvement of the NCMM in my project. So it actually just came to my mind that actually, during my last visits, I just came back I returned to the UK about 12, 13 days ago, so, and I spent about 4 weeks in Iboku. So my visit to Iboku this time around, we actually opened the project with an exhibition in collaboration with the NCMM, at Iboku. So we had a pictorial exhibition of Iboku excavation, looking at the 60 years of Iboku excavation, and more importantly, to showcase how the Iboku work 60 years ago was not only about, object hunting, but about the people, how Tostan worked with the people in the community, to achieve what, it was able to achieve at the end of the day. And then the exhibition was actually took place at the premises of the NCMM Iboku, and then all the staffs of the museum were also part of the exhibition. And the planning officer for the museum was part of our research throughout the time that we were there. So that's just to add on to what I said initially. And then now specifically on the impact of the pandemic on the research and the analysis, I think everywhere in the world globally, the pandemic has actually affected a lot of things, slowed a lot of things down. I have a number of papers that are already overdue, which I really can't lay my hands on, the data that I need for me to be able to finish the paper, because labs are closed, libraries are not working at full capacity, and then specifically labs here at Cambridge, of course, initially they were completely closed in terms of analysis, and then later on they were opened, but only to a certain kind of, group of people. And then there was a lot of, long waiting time before you can get to your turn, before you can do your work. So this actually is a kind of a ripple effect. If you can't get to the lab, you can't get the work analyzed. If you can't get the results of your analysis, you can't write, And if you can't write, you are just like kind of there, and perhaps, you're not happy, so to speak. So it's actually kind of impacted my work, not only myself, but I think, globally it has impacted the productivity of a lot of, professionals or academia as well. And in terms of field work, I think it's a very valid concern that, the question that should we be doing, field work during this pandemic? Obviously, a lot of field work has been suspended. We are supposed to be in Nigeria last year, Amanda, in Ife, and we were so excited about it that we're going to be there, we're going to do this, beautiful work. Unfortunately, that had to be canceled. I know even for myself, I had to cancel a lot of my visits. I had to suspend and delay. And me going in November last year was actually kind of a last resort for me to go at that time. And what I did, and I think one thing that we have gained from the pandemic, one of it is, this kind of conversation, this kind of platform that allows us to speak with colleagues all over around the globe without having to step out of our rooms, out of our offices. I think that is one thing that we have gained from the pandemic. And another thing that I think pandemic has actually taught us as archaeologists, working in the field, is that the need to train and involve local, collaborators in our work is very, very evident, especially at this time. This is when we will actually reap. If we have been doing that, this is time for us to reap, the results of what we have sown in the past. So how do I mean? So before my travel in November, I was supposed to travel, I think, in April, and sometimes in June or September for the Endangered Material Project Program, which I was unable to because that was the heat of COVID at the time. So I couldn't go. And at that time in Nigeria, it initially was not serious until when there was lockdown, and the lockdown was eased and the people were able to kind of, move around a little bit. So at that time, I started thinking, okay, how should I do this? And basically what I was going to do is just to, interview, get my crew together, go with our cameras and everything. So I'm like, oh, actually, I should be able to do this online. So what I did was some of my research assistants that have been working for me, whom I have trained on what we are doing and how to do it. So I was able to mobilize them, to go ahead and interview a number of people that I was going to interview. And when they are the site of the interview, we will do a video call via WhatsApp or at times Zoom. And I was actually literally remotely part of the interview without being there in person. So, and at least we're able to carry out, we're able to do some meaningful work during that time, despite the fact that I was not physically present. So the morals, so to speak, of this, pandemic and this kind of engagement and training is that if we have been involving local, people in this whole process during this period like this, we can say, oh, you know what? I need this data. Can you go to the field, get necessary permits, go to the field and do X, Y, Z and send me, and actually while they are doing it, you can actually be with them occasionally, see what they're doing, give directive and be part of the whole thing, So, and I think it worked pretty well for me while I was working with my guys, and then I think while we're actually working in Iboku, it also worked well for us because I was constantly in conversation with colleagues back here in Cambridge, discuss what we're doing, ask them for, suggestion and how to go forward. So I think that is one of the, that might really kind of not necessarily solve, but help us to navigate through ethical issue that has to do with doing field work at this time. Then I was telling because my work in the work we did at Iboku, we work with almost 30 youths from Iboku community. Most of them are undergraduates and they just, recently graduated high school students, and then we train them not as laborers, so to speak, but as partners. And the plan was for us to train them in the fundamentals of archaeological work. And I said to one of them, when they were being kind of, when they were proving hard, I told them that, you know what, if I'm not here and I need something, and I email you that, hey, guy, can you do X, Y, Z for me? Is this what you are going to do? So I think it kind of teaches us to invest more in the local community, and then later time we definitely reap, the results of that investment. So in terms of field work, I think that might be a kind of is a practical thing, and it's also a methodological, issue, which I think is very, very important.
Thank you. Gosh, Tunde, I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of a methodology that really prioritizes and values partnership and collaboration. When we build those relationships over the long term, then the challenges that we find ourselves in right now, we can use the technology to reach out, but without having built that foundation over over years, there's nothing for that to kind of latch onto. So I think we're really seeing the importance of collaboration and really of sort of building relationships and friendships, how important that is to our work in this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. And if I may quickly add that also the concept of co-knowledge production is not all putting the local's name on the paper that they are never contributed to, just by the fact that they are part of the project automatically grants them a space in your paper. But I think, this form of collaboration will make more sense in terms of looking at, co-knowledge production that we all been pushing for. So I think it's actually a way, one of the ways we should kind of consider how the local community can be part of this knowledge production. Thank you.
That's a great point. And I want to circle back to this in a little bit, because the line of our conversation right now is making me think a lot about what the African museum sector has to teach us here in North America about ways that museums, like the role of the museum and what the museum can be. And Edith, some things you said also made me think about that in terms of like the wider role that NCMM is playing in the pandemic around helping to spread good information about care. So I'm hoping we can circle back to that. But I want to turn now to another question that is important both to folks working in the museum sector and folks working in archaeology, and that's the ongoing debates and proposals regarding restitution or repatriation of African material heritage from museums in Europe and North America to their countries of origin. And we're all aware that these have gained widespread attention over the past several years. So, Mrs. Akunke, how does the NCMM approach the questions of restitution and repatriation? And as kind of a second part of that question is, how does NCMM work with other entities, whether it's communities, traditional kingdoms, ritual organizations that have historic claims to cultural objects?
Kathleen, thank you. I want to say that I'll take you back to the period of late Professor Ekweyo. He started the issue of restitution as well as repatriation in 1977 during the World Black Heritage Festival in Nigeria. And I think they went to the British Museum to loan the famous Quinidia marks, the ivory marks. And we were refused as a country and said we cannot maintain those objects because they are kept in certain atmospheric conditions and all whatnot. And that was when this issue of repatriation and restitution came on board. It was a very passionate issue in the heart of the late Professor Ekweyo, in that at that time we had money in the museum. What he did was that he sent people to markets in Britain, in other parts of Europe. If there are things for sale, in auction houses, they go and buy them. I remember a particular figure, a fertility figure. It was in display in the courtyard in Lagos Museum. That figure was bought by Professor Ekweyo. We did that. So many other figures also were bought by him back to Nigeria. So this issue of repatriation restitution, it has been there. People from time to time, director generals have come, they will revisit it again and again. And then there were always hiccups to our returning things back to Nigeria. So it has to go through diplomatic debates. Some is the long bureaucratic bottlenecks were placed for these objects not to return. And there were arguments about the fact that we cannot maintain this object. So those arguments, there were other counter arguments from Africans. I don't want to go into that, but I know that it's a burning issue. Quite recently also, we had an exhibition with Austria. I think Chicago was there also. Kathleen, when you were in Chicago Museum of Arts or so, Austria, I think the Historical Museum in Berlin and the rest, where we had this exhibition, Benin Kings and Rituals, if you could recall. I
remember it well.
At that exhibition, we had this seminar or workshop about Benin objects. And in that discussion that took place, we had this bet of the Benin dialogue, made up of Vienna at that time, North America, Chicago wasn't among, Berlin, I think British Museum, some other museum came on board later on. And we started having conversation on how to work in partnership for the restoration. Not restoration, first of all, we said, let's take it for the exhibition, joint exhibition. You know that it has always been the European museums coming for objects here in Nigeria, coming to pick up objects. For us, it was like authentication of what they are doing. But well, when you want something, you have different ways of getting those things back. So what we did was that we collaborated with them, had wonderful exhibition. And I want to say that Benin Kings and Rituals opened our eyes to depths in not only in Benin cultural objects, depth of how to go about repatriation without fighting. I think when you use diplomacy, when you use friendship, you get things more. When there's friendship, you get things more. Other than when you use violence or force, you never get things. But in friendship, we get things. And I think we formed partnership, in quote, friendship with European museums. And we started talking. We started conversing, having conversation about how this object would come. And we came back to Africa, Nigeria, let me say specifically to Nigeria. And in that discussion, we conceived the idea of doing a joint exhibition in Benin City. And then the governor of Edo State, the present governor of Edo State, Godwin Obaseki, came on board. The Benin court came on board. NCMM is there, and some other cultural stakeholders in Nigeria, as well as abroad, came on board, and we started this conversation. And Obaseki gave a promise when we were in Austria, no, not Austria, in Amsterdam, yes, recently. He gave that permission, gave assurance that he was going to put up a befitting museum in Benin Kingdom. And one of the argument is that we do not have a befitting storage, units to house the returned objects. And he says he was not going to give only an exhibition space, he was also going to build an up-to-date storage system where these objects that will be on loan, in quotes, because he's saying it should come on loan for that particular exhibition. And that's where we are now. Because of the pandemic, we're supposed to have another conversation in the British Museum, 2020, I think September 2020, but we couldn't hold it. 2021, also with the pandemic, we don't know whether we'll be able to hold that conversation, but we had Zoom meetings. We've been having Zoom meetings. Like Dr. Babalola said, that there's this new concept of Zoom meetings. Good thing that has come out of the pandemic, which is Zoom meetings, and we are continuing the conversation. And I want to say that because of this enlightenment, people on their own are returning objects back to Benin. Some people want to be partakers of that. I don't know whether you heard about the riot in Cambridge University about the okuko, that's the cock, the Benin cock, that the students say should be returned back to Nigeria. We are also negotiating about that. But some people with Benin objects, they have been returning it back to the court. But one thing is that if you want to return object back to Nigeria, you must pass through the NCMM because it's the supervising organ of our cultural heritage. Recently, I think Mr. Iheanacho brought one, about 2 plaques or some back to Benin, but he had to pass it through NCMM, and then it's in our custody until that museum is built. And again, I want to also say that this, as a result of Macron, I don't know whether you heard the Macron declaration that objects of cultural or heritage should be returned back to the country of origin. We have leached on that also, and a meeting was called. ECOWAS Forum called a meeting on repatriation and restitution of cultural properties. And it was agreed that going as a bloc, West African bloc, will be most successful than individual countries. I was in that meeting also. And one thing we have, we have weighed the pros, the advantages and disadvantages, and everybody agreed that these things should come back. Why should they say it should come back? Because certain aspects of our history, there's gaps in certain aspects of our history. And that's why people are saying return back these objects so that there will be a holistic view of what our history is all about. I want to take you back also to the Vienna issue. I don't know, Kathleen, whether you know about it. There were objects from the Benin region that people thought it was from the Oceania. It was during that research, they found out that those ivory spoons were from Benin. So you find out that there are gaps in our cultural history, and we need to fill up these gaps. And I want to also tell you that arts in Africa, arts in Nigeria is not a question of arts for the sake of arts. It's the history, the way of life of a people. And therefore, if these objects do not come back, this is my own personal view. I'm not saying that is the NCMM view. Some of these objects need to come back, and so that some of these gaps could be filled. And again, I want to say that we are sending our ethnographers to the field. There are certain rare objects that they have brought that you find out that with the objects we have in storage, they don't have the same motifs. They are, different variants. They are Nigerian objects, but the variants are different. The motifs are quite different from the ones we have here. So this issue, we are not saying this object, we are saying this object should come back, but we are not going to do it by force. But we can go through partnerships like the Benin Dialogue now, and also the Benin Dialogue saying that this thing should be returned back. And we are halfway there, and we know we are going to get there. And again, this has also given us advantage. There's a common, most museums that are members of the Benin Dialogue Group. They have agreed to put online every cultural heritage from the Benin Kingdom. There's a common documentation unit. And last year, what they did was to train people from the Benin Kingdom as well as the NCMN on digitalization of this, like Dr. Lola said, digitalization of beads. Also, we are doing digitalization of the Benin objects. And I know that it will not only be the Benin objects. If we succeed in that, it will get back to other classical objects from Igboku, from the Nok, from Nok, from Ife, and some what we call the living arts, where you have from the Bayelsa area, Cross River, and the rest, you have the living arts made out of wood, stones, and all that. And I also want to say that some of this dialogue has brought certain things to the fore. We recently had a partnership with Tara in conjunction with Phantom and funded by the US Ambassadors funds to do a conservation of the E-Comm monoliths or rock paintings in Nigeria generally. And I was in that group. It was something else. We had a wonderful time. We found out that some of these objects were taken out during the Biafran War, during the Nigerian Biafran War. Some of these objects were traced even to America. Some that were copies, they were not original. And some museums thought they were originals. They were found out that they were copies. We found out that they were copies. Those are some of the advantages we have in this partnership. And let me tell you, we did a wonderful job in these rock paintings. Went up to the north, down to E-Comm. We found out areas they had not investigated and also involved the community. I liked what Babalola said. He said they had to involve the community. We involve the community. We'll have a meeting with the community. We'll tell them that these are their cultural heritage. That's what the museum is trying to do. So we had to use that forum to teach them they need to preserve their cultural heritage. Some rituals, will I say, some cultural activities. I don't like the word ritual. Cultural activities, because it's a way of life of the people. Some cultural activities were revived. That particular project gave, especially in that Alok area, gave money to them to revive some cultural activities during the New Yam Festival. Those things were sacrificed to those monoliths. They are regarded as ancestors, but because of the issue of Christianity, those things were no longer worshipped. But in the course of this partnership, there was revival of those rituals or cultural activities. And then we made them to know that these things are theirs for posterity, that they are not just there for the sake of being there. It's for them to teach their children and to protect those objects from invaders, from thieves, from destruction of our, sometimes it's not only thieves, some Christians that are overzealous, they go and destroy those cultural objects in situ. So these are some of the things. Every place we went to, every of those villages we went to, we had one-on-one contact with the community through the chief and everything. And it was a glorious time. Even in the north also, in the north, Islam also. In the south, it's a bit better that we still have cultural objects. In the north, it's something else. But what we did at that time to tell them also, particularly the rock paintings, it is seen, like I said, these things are not arts for art's sake. They are the way of life of a people. And when we went to Jigawa State, we found out that some of those people go to the rocks and scrape out part of it and use it to make what you call juju or medicine, traditional medicine for the cure of certain diseases. So we had to tell them that these things are your cultural heritage. Please do not deface them. Those were the education we gave to the people. And we were supposed to have done, an exhibition in Lagos, in Jos, in ABU, and other places. And it didn't happen because of the COVID. And also, one of the advantages of that partnership was that we worked with the university community. It was just not the museum per se. Ahmadu Bello was involved, University of Calabar was involved. So these are things that, has brought impact in the museum work and is taking us forward. Thank you. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Akunke. It's great to hear your passion for this topic. And you really helped us, I think, to connect some of the threads, both between, the history, like, as you pointed out, the long time history of work by African professionals in seeking restitution, but also, the ways that efforts like the Savoy-Sarr report connect to efforts like the Benin Dialogue Group, and how those all really connect to work that's being done in country around cultural heritage and cultural heritage education. It's a much bigger picture than sometimes is apparent, when you read the paper, and it sort of sensationalizing or bringing attention to the higher, level conversations that are happening, say at the kind of level of Macron. So that's really, really interesting. Dr. Babalola, turning to you, how are you, what's your experience with this question of restitution repatriation, and the way Edith has sort of painted a picture for us of its integration into, the daily work of NCMM, or in your case, your own archaeological work?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think I should thank Mrs. Ekuke for really educating all of us on that, efforts by the NCMM on restitution. And like Caitlin said, she provided a long-time historical perspective, to the work on restitution and the repatriation in Nigeria. So I think she has done a very nice job, and she provided a very practical and a first-hand professional experience, how she engaged on the ground with this issue. But for me, it's more theoretical. I've not really been physically part of this conversation. And however, I've been part of it, on a kind of a theoretical level, discussion and organizing panels. I remember February 2019, HICO organized a panel discussion with a colleague in the Center of South Asian Studies here at Cambridge, and we did a discussion panel on the repatriation, restitution, and the reconciliation. And we invited Catherine Cole, the then Secretary General of the Canadian Association of Museums. I don't know if she's still the Secretary General. So in that discussion, one of the things that actually came up was, the politics and the ethical issues, surrounding repatriation and the restitution, which I think almost everybody agreed upon, that is a very kind of a multifaceted issue, which required a very broad, multifaceted approach, like Mrs. Ekuke really quite mentioned, which shows that there is no one way of solving this problem of repatriation and restitution, going by a kind of, applying a kind of, let's say, so to speak, militant approach, like kind of, you want to kind of have it by force. It is obvious that that's not going to work, more or less. I think one of the issues that also came up in the discussion was, the issue of compromise. When you look at how it's going to work out at the end of the day, you realize that on both sides, there's, a lot of compromises we have, to be taken on both sides in terms of how, when, where, and, other things that actually come into place with the restitution and the repatriation. And the one thing that I think is also very important that Mrs. Ikuki also mentioned, which came up also in the discussion, was the issue of dealing with the nation state versus dealing with the community, where these materials or these objects actually came from. So many times, many countries deal with the nation state. For example, in the case of Nigeria, when you are dealing with NCMM, of course, NCMM is the channel through which you have to go through. However, when you are dealing with NCMM solely, without considering this, local community and the local perspective about this object, obviously it's not going to work, because even the local, for example, British Museum, for example, just an hypothetical situation, could argue that these objects were not taken from Nigeria, they were taken from Benin Empire. So we need somebody from Benin Empire, or somebody that represents, the interest of Benin Empire, for us to start this kind of conversation. So of course, we all know that Benin Empire is no more in existence, of course, speaking, but we now have Benin in the nation state Nigeria. So how do we bridge that gap between negotiating with the nation state and also the local community that are really connected with this material? And sadly enough, at the end of the day, most of the time when these objects are actually returned, they are returned to the nation states, not to the local community. And then the local community are the people that are actually yearning for the return of these objects. They are the people that are kind of connected, with the objects. So that is a kind of, complex series that I don't know how that could be solved. Maybe Ms. Ikuki has an idea on how that, bridge kind of could be, that gap could be bridged anyway, but I think for me, the local perspective to this object and also to repatriation and the restitution is very, very important. And many times, like a colleague, Dr. Kilishi, I was calling by his name anyway, I can't remember his last name, who, he has published a lot on the cultural heritage in Nigeria. He's currently based at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. He talks about, local perspective on this issue of repatriation. Like, for example, he looks into, the symbolism and the meaning of, those objects to the local people. He gave a very good example. For example, the Ikenga, in Igbo land that we all know. So he's of the opinion that, for example, if you see Ikenga somewhere on the antiquity market and you are clamoring for the return of that object, so what would the return mean to the local people? That, for example, Ikenga, when it's lost or damaged, so there is a traditional way of kind of depowering that lost Ikenga, and then a new one is made, and then the new one is now made to be potent like the lost one, through some kind of ritual process. So as a nation state, we are fighting for these objects to bring them back. But when you talk to local people, it doesn't really make any sense to them anymore, because to them, they don't really have any form of kind of a cultural or spiritual or religious attachment to this object anymore, because to them, it doesn't represent them anymore, because it's been lost, it's been moved out of its original context, and that's kind of, devalue it, culturally, and they have made a new one. So I'm not generalizing, but I'm just citing that as a kind of an example of the complexities surrounding the issue of, repatriation, and how the local perspective, not only on the repatriation itself, but also their perspective on the particular objects that we're asking for, is very important in the process of, trying to strike, a deal on the repatriation. I hope that is, meaningful to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Today, I mean, we could go on talking about this for, for many hours. I think that this question of how restitution and repatriation, the perspective on it from the local, and the communities, the original communities is a really important one. The Benin Dialogue Group, I think, offers a really interesting approach to bringing all parties to the table, in that, the museums are all represented in the group, but so, and as is the NCMM, but so is the Court of Benin. And Edith, I wonder if, before we move on to the next question, you wanted to respond in any way to some of what Tunde said or the questions he raised.
Okay. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Tunde, I want to say that the Nigeria of now is not the Nigeria of the past, because some people have stopped sacrificing, you know what it is, to these objects. And if you take them back there, you find out that they do not connect to them. We have some objects in NCMM just because of theft and other destructive tendencies from the society. Some cultural objects are in NCMM. And when those people need them for cultural display or cultural ceremonies, they come to pick them up from the museum. So it's an alternative of returning the objects back to the place of origin when they do not have a connection. Sometimes some of them bring these objects and say, could you keep them for us? Which we do, they are in the stores. And when they have some of those ceremonies, they come pick up the object. If you remember this Benin, the Queen Mother bust, it's with us. And every time they need it, they come and pick it up, but you have to apply for it so that you can preserve it. It's there in the store. They apply for it. They have to insure it because it's a wonderful piece. You have to insure it, take it for exhibition. Like when Prince Charles came to Nigeria, they picked it up from us, did an exhibition for him. So we have other cultural objects. We also have monuments where you have cultural objects there, and there are shrines where people come and do their various rituals and ceremonies there, cultural ceremonies there. And even the monolith I spoke about, they are in situ in the various communities, but they go into those places and do the ceremonies. They don't take the objects out. We have people that go from time to time to make sure that those objects are preserved. So there's the Nigeria of the yesteryears is not the Nigeria of today. Tunde, you should know that. It's not something I want to go into, but the issue is that some, when they come into the museum, they're quite excited. Oh, people still have this object. My grandfather, this person used it. And then when they see some of the information on display, that's how we interact with communities. They'll say, oh, this information is not correct. Take this off, add this. This was what this object was used for. So it makes for interaction. And you know that the focus of the museum now is to interact with the communities and build up a better community. Culture is dynamic. We must agree. You take from here, add to here, and make a better society. We are not saying our culture in totality was the best. No, we had issues with some of the cultural policies or cultural practices, let me say, in the past. So you tend to use those objects to teach people. That's what we do. We don't just exhibit objects. We tell a story out of the object in Nigeria, so that you pick out the good things out of the object and then the bad one, which we can change, the disadvantaged one, which we can change. So these are some of the things. Even in schools, we go for outreach programs with this object and say, look, this is what, and because of that, some people are interested in cultural studies now. The younger ones are interested in cultural studies. So these things, there's no one straight path about repatriation as well as restitution, whether it should be kept in a museum or in the cultural entity where those things were created. There are too many things involved. And I want to remind you, even in Ife, you don't have artisans making some of those objects. You don't have them. but in Benin, you have them. So those people are encouraged to continue. So some of these things, we really need to be careful and take careful decisions when it comes to storage and preservation of our objects. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer and for reminding us that the modern, where we are now is very different than the past. And I sort of continue in that line of questioning in some ways to segue into a discussion of how social justice movements in recent years have really impacted the way we view the connections between past and present, as well as sort of cultures at a global scale as well. Specifically, we've seen the growth in 2020, but also, for several years before this, of movements both on a local scale and globally. And I'm thinking here particularly of Black Lives Matter and Me Too, as well as the End SARS movement in Nigeria. I wondered if I could ask each of you to reflect on how these and maybe other social justice movements have impacted your work. I want to start with you, Tunde, because I know you've been heavily involved in the decolonizing heritage movement in the UK and more globally, with an exciting series of events, for example. If you could speak to that as it suits you.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I think it's very important to actually, look at the connection of the development of this, social movement, with, changing paradigm in some of the way we actually do our work, in the academia as academics, So for me, I think decolonizing what some of this movement has done, or has contributed to how we see heritage in particular, African heritage or heritage in general, is that when we say we are even decolonizing, the question is, what exactly are we decolonizing? Are we talking about, I remember during this, the panel discussion or during one of my classes, I can't remember exactly, I raised a question like, if we see the colonizing movement as a kind of, colonizing debate as a movement, compared to, for example, during the time of the movement, against colonialism, and we were fighting for independence and stuff like that. So at some point, that was achieved, in terms of independence, to almost all the British colony and stuff like that. So can we now say that we get to a point whereby we say, oh, we have decolonized, and then we stop there, that is it? So it's a kind of a very complex situation. I think it's a kind of decolonizing is a kind of an old way of doing things coming back in a kind of a new package. So it's not the first time that, it's not just like this year, last year, not even 10 years ago, that this idea of the idea of decolonization has been out there, and a lot of people have actually worked to make sure that, a lot of this idea about how we perceive the past, how we perceive Africa is, decolonized. And I think one of the things that I think is good about this idea of decolonizing heritage is that when we say decolonizing, many people think about we're just trying to decolonize from, from the West, but I think even when you look at it closely, there is also need for us to decolonize from our own self, like the way we practice, this discipline, the way we approach this idea. There is also need for us to decolonize. And a very typical example would be the way we teach heritage studies, the way we teach cultural studies, the way we approach the community, the way we, talk to school kids about, about archaeology, about heritage study, about cultural studies. We have to change our ways to meet up with the contemporary post-colonial way of life, and went to the fact that most of the curriculum or the curricula that we use in teaching, even in universities across Africa, were designed, by, during the colonial period. And there is need for us to decolonize those curriculum, by introducing a kind of, indigenous view and indigenous flavor to it. I remember I once asked someone who is a graduate of history from one of the Nigerian universities, about his best, class in school, and he told me European history, And I remember I also had someone also about, similar question. And what you see is that it seems that they were taught more of European and American history than Nigerian history itself. So that is another way of decolonizing, not necessarily going after, colonial masters or, colonial agenda, but also looking at how we can, by ourselves, locally, redesign how we teach and how we, engage and interact with these very important and, very important issues that has to do with cultural studies and heritage studies. I think I'll just draw the curtain there for now.
Thank you, Tunde. This has just opened up so many different conversations. I wish we had more time to follow each one of these really important threads. But we are sort of wrapping up a little bit because we're close to running out of time. But I wanted to ask Mrs. Okunke if she wanted to reflect on this issue of decolonizing heritage or social justice movements and their impact in Nigeria on the museums in particular.
Well, I agree with Tunde. This issue of romanticizing the African culture should be a thing of the past. Let's come back to current reality. Whether you like it or not, the humanity, they're interrelated. If you get into history, you begin to wonder why all this dichotomy, why all this division? Because there are certain words you find in some of these European countries that you find in Africa. And if you ask them, what is the origin? It was there before colonization. So some of these things, for me, I feel that take the good from the West, take the good from Africa and combine it and make a better society out of it. I'll give you an example. In Africa, we have this family orientation. You are there for your sister, you are there for your brother, you are there for your cousin, you are there for your fifth generation brothers and sisters, and it makes for interaction, it makes for humanity. But in the West, you have this individualistic way of relating to people. I think they should borrow from us the fact that if you live in community, it makes for a better society. And then for us, we should also get from the white people because they think further than us. They plan further than us. Instead of going into the fact that to be frank, every life matters. Whether the Black life, whether the white life, every life for me matters. The issue is that talking about the fact that lives in general matters as a whole. So the question of decolonization, we can never extract from our history the period of colonization. It is what we do with it that matters. The light we take it, is it from a positive light? I've seen where, I will just give you an example. I've seen where children from polygamous home in Africa has said, look, I will not go back to what my forefathers did. I will not have more than one wife because I've seen the evils of polygamy. And they go forward and say, look, I'm marrying one wife and one wife it must be. And they keep to it. So these are some of the things that you need to go inwards and decolonize yourself, if there's anything like that, and then come to the larger society and do that, do a perfect work that will make us look at human beings of equal standing and, equal capability. Not saying this one, because the color is different, the person is not mentally sound. Because this person's color is different, the person is mentally sound. I've seen where Blacks, either whites, by reason of what they can give to the society by reason of their intellectual, mentality. They're able to rise above, segregation, discrimination. So for me, I feel as a person, there's a certain level you get to, you will not be discriminated, whether you are in the white society or in the Black society, because you are relevant in that particular, and people must look for you. That's my own contribution.
Well, I just want to take a second to thank Mrs. Edith Akunke and Dr. Babatunde Babalola, both of you, for participating in this conversation, which has been so rich. And like I said before, we could keep on talking for a very long time, but this has been just a delight to spend this time with you. And Amanda, thanks to you as well.